Good afternoon. My name is John Herbst, and I'd like to welcome you here at the Atlantic Council for an event this afternoon regarding gas markets in Europe and Gazprom. I'd like to tell you this is actually something of an unusual setting. I mean, we meet in this room all the time, but we usually meet with the dais up there speaking out the entire room. So this is a new approach. I hope you like it. We have two panels for you this afternoon. We have first this panel, and I am not going to provide the bios of each of our speakers. They are world-class speakers on the subject. I will simply introduce them, and we will get started straight away. But before we do that, we can be followed. We're at AC Eurasia, Future Ukraine, for those of us who follow us on Twitter. And now I would like to begin. We have Anders Osland on the far left, Rick Burt next to him, Agnia Grigas, and then Yuri Vitrenko. And I'd like to start out with a question for Anders regarding Gazprom. And how, Anders, do you see Gazprom working in Russia, its connection to the political elite, its connection in the economy?
Well, soon after Vladimir Putin came to power, in May 2001, he changed the management of Gazprom. This was a tense event that, as is suitable in Moscow, took place in the Kremlin. And I've heard this from my good friend Boris Fyodorov, who was then became a member of the Gazprom board. At the time, the old management under Chernomyrdin had robbed Gazprom empty. It turned out that several parts of Gazprom had ended up belonging to the children of Viktor Chernomyrdin, the former prime minister, and Rem Yacherev, the then head of Gazprom. So people said Putin has to do something to stop this robbery, and that he did. He changed the management and appointed Alexei Miller, who was one of his former assistants in St. Petersburg. And Alexei Miller remains CEO of Gazprom today. To begin with, it did look as if something positive was happening in Gazprom. They took back several of the assets that had been stripped from Gazprom, but it lasted only so long. But then, in 2006, Putin liberalized the trade in Gazprom stocks, and the Gazprom stocks skyrocketed until May 2008, when the market capitalization of Gazprom traded in London was $369 billion. After that, I can't say anything positive about Gazprom. The stock value now is just under $60 billion. Alexei Miller is still the CEO, although he has seen a value destruction of $310 billion. That is quite extraordinary. I'm not aware of anybody short of Enron who has destroyed so much capital. And clearly Miller is doing something right because he's still there. What is he doing right? I would say that he's doing three things right. The first thing is that he's absolutely loyal to Vladimir Putin. That's the main requirement for somebody who runs a big state corporation in Russia. And the second thing is that he makes sure that the money goes to the right people. That is the brothers Rotenberg and Gennady Timchenko and Yuri Kovalchuk. The first three are building the pipelines for Gazprom in no-bid contracts that are probably priced at about twice as much as they should. So Gazprom is simply a money machine for Putin's friends. Yuri Kovalchuk has taken over now 20 television channels. So when people talk about Russian state TV, they really mean Kovalchuk TV. And Kovalchuk has also, just in case, taken over the financial assets of Gazprom, which were very substantial. So this is probably the biggest robbery of a state company we have seen anywhere. This is what Gazprom is really about. But I forget one function, or rather I don't forget it, the third function. That is what is for Agnia to discuss, the geopolitical role of Gazprom. The people who don't count are the shareholders. And I should mention tomorrow I will launch my book, Russia's Crony Capitalist, the path from market economy to kleptocracy. And Gazprom is one little story in this book. Thank you.
In fact, it was my mistake not to mention that book when I gave Andrews the floor. But I will not make that mistake with our next speaker, Agni Grigas, who will talk about the geopolitics of Gazprom activity. And she wrote a book called The Geopolitics of Gas, which came out last year, which she conveniently has a copy of for you to see. And I highly recommend as well as Andrews' book. Agni, please.
Okay. Well, if we look at Gazprom as an entity, I would say Gazprom has long been a tool of the Kremlin, a tool for energy diplomacy. Now, here it's a little bit where you stand, whether you're going to call it energy diplomacy or you're going to call it the energy weapon. But it really falls in between on that spectrum. Gazprom has been used to strike friendships, establish diplomatic relationships, to award allies, both states and politicians in foreign states. And Gazprom has also been used to punish neighboring states, uncooperative foreign governments, and so on. And in terms of the role and the importance of Gazprom, I think one quote from Vladimir Putin actually spells it out quite well. Back in 2003, when Gazprom was celebrating its 10-year anniversary, since it was reestablished as a company before it was the Soviet Ministry of Gas. So Vladimir Putin stated, Gazprom is a powerful political and economic lever of influence over the rest of the world. So let's, I think some of the more interesting examples of this use of energy diplomacy or the energy weapon is to what extent it has been used in Western European countries. Really going back to the Soviet era when the Soviet Union first started exporting its gas to European states, it established strong relationships with European energy companies like Germany's Ruhrgas, now it's E.ON, companies, Engie, Gaz de France, and so on. So, and subsequently in the 2000s, Gazprom continued to build on those relationships, giving preferable gas deals to a lot of these European energy companies. Also, of course, establishing strong political relationships with German political leadership, such as George Schroeder, over projects such as the Nord Stream pipeline. If we look at some of the punishments that some of these, let's say, uncooperative or less cooperative states have received, of course, we're familiar with the gas halts to Ukraine in 2006 and 2009. But here, maybe I'd like to highlight what maybe has received a little less attention, is how Gazprom was used to essentially, I would say, enact almost extortion on some of these countries with the case of Ukraine. And we'll see how this connects to present-day events with Crimea. So essentially, in Ukraine was running up large gas debts throughout the 90s. And in 1997, Russia and Ukraine signed a deal that Russia would, or Gazprom would forgive Ukraine's 800 million gas debt so that Russia could establish its Black Sea fleet and keep the fleet there until 2017. So, deals like this, of course, and the subsequent one in 2010, which again renewed Russia's ability to keep the Black Sea fleet in Sevastopol and Crimea, also done on the basis of debt forgiveness or gas price reductions, helped Russia establish its military presence and consolidate their naval presence in that region, which of course we know the final result of. So again, these are some of the ways Gazprom has been used, not really just as a commercial entity, but really as a means of energy diplomacy or energy weaponry.
Okay, thank you. Yuri Vitrenko from Naftagaz. You've had a great deal of experience with Gazprom, both in negotiations and, for that matter, in litigation. If you could provide some insight to us.
It's very easy to negotiate and litigate against Gazprom. You just listen to what they say and expect that they would do the opposite. For example, when they say that, they, in general, it's kind of Russia's narrative that they want to stop subsidizing Ukraine. Ukraine was getting some cheap gas from Russia for years, and then Russia wanted to basically switch to market terms. What in fact it meant, and we proved it in the arbitration, that they wanted just to sell gas to Ukraine at the price that was higher than the market price, higher than the European price, on completely non-European terms, volumes that actually Ukraine did not even need. At the same time, they did not pay enough for transit services. When, for example, you litigate against Gazprom, so they first tell you, okay, so let's go to an international arbitration and let the arbitrary tribunal decide who is right and who is wrong. And then they lose in this arbitration, and instead of just honoring the tribunal's award, they start playing games, basically moving assets, hiding their assets all over the world, and again challenging the award on some ridiculous grounds. But when you get used to it, as you mentioned again, fortunately or unfortunately, I have some experience in dealing with Gazprom, you just know what to expect from them. And speaking of the books, because it seems like all the panelists wrote some books, I haven't written a book yet, so I have just started, so I'm writing some small brochures basically. But we have like a small brochure, again, like about relationship and or standoff between Naftagaz and Gazprom, and the bigger one basically for people who already either know enough about Ukraine and Naftagaz and our relationship with Gazprom, or want to know much more. And in these brochures, so they're also available online. You can get much more insights and to some extent even some kind of flavor what it means to deal with Gazprom. And you can also read about some very tangible results that Naftagaz and Ukraine managed to achieve when we changed our relationship with Gazprom, when we insisted on European rules and again the rule of law in general, instead of these political deals that we used to have in the past. Just like one number, so the result of this change over the last 5 years, so with the new team came in 2014, so we changed this relationship with Gazprom, and the financial result of these changes that has been already realized, it's roughly $60 billion. So it's again roughly half of Ukrainian GDP. So you may feel the importance of these kind of changes.
You might want to explain to the audience how that $60 billion breaks down.
Okay, so we just compared basically what we paid and what we received from Gazprom with what we had to pay under the contract that was signed in 2009 as a famous deal between Tymoshenko and Putin, where Putin explained to the whole world that was kind of a switch to European terms. And unfortunately, these agreements were even supported by the European Union at that time. Then in the arbitration, we managed to prove that these agreements were very far from European terms. So we won in the arbitration. We also started buying gas from Europe rather than from Russia, again at European prices. And we managed to prove that they had to pay much more for the transit services that we provide. So, and if you compared cash flows under these two scenarios, the financial effect of this change is like $60 billion. Again, in these brochures we're showing all the numbers, how it was calculated and how it should be analyzed.
Okay, thank you. Thus far we have focused overwhelmingly on Gazprom and its various elements of its activity, But Rick, you know a great deal about the gas market in Europe, and if you could provide an overall picture.
Well, John, first of all, I haven't written a book about it. and I haven't even written a brochure about it. So I really don't belong up here. First of all, I know very little about Gazprom. In fact, I'm going to make a very candid admission right now. I've never even met anybody from Gazprom. So I do want to talk about the fact, though, that Gazprom has to operate in the European market. The European Union is the world's largest importer of gas. And since the really late 1960s, they've been importing gas from Russia. Under Russian law, as I understand it, only Gazprom is permitted to actually export gas, so they've had this relationship with Gazprom. I'm not going to comment so much on the past, but what is interesting is since the 1960s, since the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, the gas market in Europe and worldwide has increasingly become deregulated and liberalized. And so increasingly it reflects more of the oil market and less of the traditional market that Gazprom was able to exploit. In the old days, Gazprom was able to negotiate these long-term agreements, fixed price. You had to take these deliveries, and it was insensitive to pricing. But thanks, I think, to market forces, both within Europe, reform the gas directives within the EU, the construction of infrastructure, mainly interconnections between different pipelines, and more globally, a creation of a global gas market, and growing finally, and this is really critical if you want to understand Europe, the growth of natural gas as a transition fuel from the more polluting carbon energy sources like coal to alternatives. The demand for gas in Europe has mushroomed. So, for example, and in full disclosure, I, with my colleagues at McClarty Associates, represent the 5 European gas companies that are working with Gazprom on Nord Stream 2. Every one of those gas companies projects a major gas gap that will emerge over the next 20 years, both owing to the decline in indigenous production of gas in Europe, like most notably in the Netherlands, but also the growth of new sources of gas, including, for example, American LNG. Now, most of the projections of these 5 clients of mine are that their imports of natural gas from Russia are going to be roughly the same in percentage terms. So that percentage in terms of Europe as a whole is going to be roughly, in their view, between 35 to 40% of their imported gas is going to come from Russia. Even with Nord Stream 2, that figure is not going to grow substantially because of the fact that Europe as a whole is going to need so much more external gas. What is really going to grow substantially in the view of my clients is imports of natural gas, not only from the United States, but from other sources. So you're going to see not a kind of choice, a strategic choice for the Europeans between natural gas, pipe gas versus LNG, but you're going to see a combination of the two. Now, I think this has important geopolitical implications. Those people who argue, and unfortunately President Trump is one of them, who says that Germany, for example, gets 70% of its energy from Russian natural gas, are wrong. Right now, Germany, in terms of its total energy needs, gets about 9% of its energy from Russian natural gas. And again, in terms of the projections of our clients, that figure is not going to fundamentally change going forward. What will change is that Germany and other EU members are going to need to import much more external natural gas from the United States in LNG, from North Africa in terms of pipe gas and LNG, from the Gulf, and from the Caspian, and from the Eastern Mediterranean. So that's the energy story. So to the extent that you think Gazprom is an evil actor, Europe is not going to be more dependent than it is now. And final point, if you look at Europe and the international gas market, and you look at Russia, who is more dependent looking ahead over the next 10, 20 years on natural gas? The people that are going to buy it, or the people that are going to produce it? And in my view, Russia, with an economy growing at less than 1% of its GDP per year, that has failed to diversify its economy, is far more dependent on the sale of natural gas and oil than Europe is in buying it from all the different sources it has, including the United States. So the bottom line for me, the strategic bottom line for me is Russia needs to sell that gas to Europe more than Europe needs to buy it. So Russia is losing leverage and the EU is gaining it. And as a strategic instrument, Europe holds the whip hand, not Gazprom.
All right, Rick, that's a very interesting remark, and I'll give you a chance to, actually, if you want, you jump in right now, then I'll come back with something else.
Just to follow up with that Russia is losing leverage and Europe is gaining leverage. This is true. The market conditions have changed tremendously. There is much more liquidity in the markets. There are many more options. And Russia is losing leverage. But projects like Nord Stream 2 is really, for me, I interpret it as a kind of desperate effort while Russia is losing leverage over the European markets to still try to hold on to them and lock them into this long-term pipeline infrastructure project, to still try to hold on to some key European markets for themselves, such as Germany.
Okay, go ahead.
First of all, again, speaking of your clients, we should probably understand that they're to some extent at least biased, meaning that speaking of your clients, basically Nord Stream 2 partners of Gazprom, they are at least basically biased. There are two sources of this bias. Yes. So the first one is basically, but we understand the nature of this bias. So first of all, they all remember the so-called golden era of the gas industry in Europe. That has nothing to do with markets, where they had very cozy relationship with Gazprom. And together, basically, they had like a monopoly in the European market, overcharging the European consumers and basically helping Russia to earn money, so that after that, Russia used this money, for example, to invade Georgia or to invade Ukraine. And only with the development of, for example, US LNG and the US shale revolution, basically, we saw so-called decoupling, when there was a real market and your clients tried fighting against the market. They basically lost. Now gas prices in Europe are much lower than they used to be because of American LNG, not even coming to Europe, but because making, again, the global market like a market. And that is why they're trying to fight back, basically, and to remember, again, or to bring back these times when they enjoyed enormous, basically, profits because of anti-competitive behavior. Also, just, for example, a very, again, simple example why they're biased. They're, for example, lending money to Gazprom for Nord Stream 2 project at a rate that is 3 times higher, basically, than the market, the cost of capital for Gazprom or the market value of Gazprom debt. If it's not a bribe, basically, so if you're allowed to lend money to Gazprom at 10%, whereas Gazprom can get money in the market for 3%, and these companies basically just pocket the difference, then to tell everybody that, in fact, basically, again, Europe is not increasing its reliance on Gazprom. So that's very brief comment, maybe not that brief, but an important one at least, about the nature of the bias of this company. And just the last one is about the reliance of Europe. Of course, Europe is increasing reliance on Russia. And there is a very clear example what happens when you depend on Russian gas. It's like, let's recall 2009, when Russia interrupted supplies to Ukraine, and not just to Ukraine, because again, through Ukraine, gas goes to Europe, but also to such countries as Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and many other Central European countries, causing a human catastrophe over there. So some people were dying. So you can, of course, tell the story that, in fact, Russia is more dependent on these revenues, but they did not care about their revenues when they basically made people die because of the interruption of gas. And it's the same story everywhere.
Okay, Rick?
Yeah, I guess, first of all, to the extent any of these companies that are doing this work are biased, they're biased to shareholder value and their shareholders. And I only point out that I think of the 5 companies involved, at least 4 of them are very actively engaged in the LNG business. In fact, the largest importer of LNG into Europe is Engie, the French natural gas company. So you can't argue that these guys are somehow beholden to Gazprom. What they're beholden to are their shareholders, and they are beholden to doing good business. And they would not be engaged in the Nord Stream 2 program and in actively buying American LNG and trying to source it elsewhere if it wasn't good business. Tomorrow, we will have, for example, a member of the management board of Uniper, the German gas company, who will be seeing Dick Morningstar yet tomorrow. And he's here, he's not here to promote Nord Stream 2. Surprise, surprise. He's here to meet the Deputy Secretary of Energy to talk about sourcing more American LNG. So we have to get out of this mindset, it seems to me, of thinking about this purely in geopolitical terms, thinking about it in geoeconomic terms, and recognize we're going through an energy revolution. And one really good, positive thing, and it's had an impact on Gazprom, is the American shale revolution. The fact that we are now being able to sell oil and gas to the degree we are has forced Gazprom to lower its prices, has forced Gazprom to to go along with market changes and liberalization in Europe. And this is a good thing. It's not a bad thing.
Okay, I'd like to jump in for a moment. Rick, you're right that there have been overall changes in the gas market, which in fact has weakened Gazprom's and Russia's position. And I also agreed with that. And you said that the leverage of, for example, Europe is growing. And no one has ever confused me with following a soft policy towards the Kremlin. What we've seen on military issues, for example, regarding the Kremlin's war in Donbass, and I think also in the gas sector, is that by and large the West has not been willing to use its superior position. And I think that's true in the gas issue as well as it's true in broader issues of war and peace. Now, coming back to gas, the key to Nord Stream 2 brings us to Germany. And for actually, on your point, Rick, that yes, the Western companies involved are pursuing their economic interests. But Yuri's point was that, in effect, Gazprom was providing them a subsidy so that it was in their economic interest to pursue this project. And Anders can talk about whether or not this project makes economic sense from the point of view of Russia. And I'll give that to Anders in a minute. But the point I want to make here is this. The position of Germany in favor of Nord Stream 2 has an effect, or the position of Chancellor Merkel has toughened over the past 4 or 5 months, more assertive in pushing for this project. Merkel had offered a compromise a year ago, or a little bit more than a year ago, that in order to secure the interest of all parties, even as Nord Stream 2 was built, a large supply of gas through the Ukrainian pipeline would be guaranteed. This was her proposal from over a year ago. So Ukraine's interests were not in any way taken away from Nord Stream 2, this would be part of the deal. But then about 2 months ago, the Russian Minister of Energy, Novak, said in Europe that when asked, would Ukraine continue to be a conduit for Russian gas, he said, well, if it's economically viable, which everybody agrees to, and if Naftahaz dropped all of its disputes with Russia, with Gazprom, which won through international arbitration. So that's point one. Point two, Medvedev, the prime minister of Russia, said roughly the same thing. Okay. Your attention is still very strong, I know. As we both get older, it's still very good. Medvedev added a third condition about 6 weeks ago, saying, no, you also have to have quote-unquote political stability in Ukraine, and we know how the Kremlin defines political stability in Ukraine. And then finally, about 3 weeks before the Ukrainian presidential elections, Medvedev and Miller and others invited Yuri Boyko, a Ukrainian presidential candidate who's seen as somewhat sympathetic to the Kremlin, to Moscow, and they met with him publicly. And they said, if people like Boyko come into power, we'll sell gas at reduced prices. And by the way, we're going to shut off any gas supplies to Europe when our contract ends at the end of this year. Why am I telling you all this? Because all of these things fly directly in the face of the compromise that Merkel had proposed. And I was in Berlin 6 or 8 weeks ago, and I even heard from the MFA that they were concerned about this. But we've seen no change in the German position and no talk back to this clear provocation coming from the Kremlin. Now, you're welcome to respond.
Well, here's how I will respond. First of all, probably looking, and I'm just trying to be objective here and not get into this issue yet that you raised, but just talking about the German situation, which is just to recognize is that these guys, rightly or wrongly, have found themselves very dependent on natural gas. Because what they've done on the one hand, because after the Fukushima episode, the Germans decided they were going to get out of the nuclear business altogether. Even the Japanese didn't take that decision, but the Germans did. Then, of course, because on environmental grounds and the Paris Accords and so on, they want to get out of the coal business, and they were very heavily dependent on coal. They were even importing coal from the United States, and still are, as far as I know. So they have found themselves, of all, I would say, of most, if not all the EU countries, this commitment they have to transitioning and meeting their obligations under the Paris Accords and getting to the middle of this century with substantially less environmental damage makes them highly dependent on natural gas. And that's one reason why, and I find it very interesting, that the German government is now prepared to spend money on building the first LNG terminals in Germany. And they want to take deliveries of U.S. natural gas. This is a fundamentally new development, and I applaud that. Now, on the whole question of Ukraine, all I can say is, and I haven't followed that as closely as you have, John, but I do know that the Russians had a very clear, very strong position of opposition to any further gas transit across Ukraine until about 12, 14 months ago. And the reason that position changed and that the Russians started talking about their willingness to transit gas across Ukraine was because of the Germans, because of Angela Merkel. And the Minister of Economic Affairs and Energy, Altmaier, took the lead of going both to the EU, going to Kiev, and talking to the Russians in Moscow, both in government and in Gazprom, about publicly stating that after Nord Stream 2 was deployed, there would be gas transits. Now, as far as I know, sure, the Russians may have put a lot of new issues on the table. So have the Ukrainians. I want to remind everybody in this room that at the end of this year, the current agreement between Naftagaz and Gazprom runs out. And this is a time in which, especially with a new president elected and Rada elections this fall, there's going to be a lot of jockeying for position. So I'm not surprised that the Russians aren't saying things and the Ukrainians aren't saying things. But I believe, I'll make 2 points and then shut up. I believe if Nord Stream 2 goes forward, that the Germans will only permit it to go forward if gas transits of Ukraine continue. I can't tell you how many BCM annually. That's a matter for negotiation, as is the pricing and so on. But I think the Germans have made it very clear that that Ukraine cannot be left out. But secondly, if for one reason or another Nord Stream 2 is not deployed as a result of Ukrainian lobbying and other opposition, and sanctions, what have you, that the Russians are not, I think the Russians are not likely to be very positive about Ukrainian gas trans.
Thank you. Wait, Andrews, then Yuri.
Yeah, let me return actually to what Rick talked about at the beginning, how the European gas market now functions. And I can say that I agree with half of it and disagree with half of it. So to begin with, of course, gas is much better than coal. You get twice as much energy out of gas than you get of coal. But to jump from that to say that there will be a transition to gas is incorrect. Because essentially what we are talking about is heating and electricity. And these are long-term installations. And coal is essentially used in 3 European countries only today: Germany, Poland, and the Czech Republic. In each case, you have strong constituencies for the usage of coal. This cannot change much. So this is not a strong argument. And then the second argument that Europe now has a market for gas, which is very important, that it looks ever more like the oil market. This is a very important point. But this comes very much from the third energy package of the European Union from the summer of 2009, which was provoked by 2 weeks of Russia cutting off gas supply to Europe. So it's a direct consequence of Russian gas aggression. And 4 days in January 2006 woke up Europe a little bit, but not sufficiently. And the third energy package, it means substantial marketization, it means converters, it means much more storage for gas. So this has really improved the situation. And then the third point that Rick very rightly pointed out is that Russia is much more vulnerable than Europe with regard to gas, because Russia needs to sell its gas. The sales to Europe now is slightly over 130 BCM per year, and Russia has an overcapacity of 100 BCM. Where can Russia sell gas otherwise? Well, a little bit of LNG from Yamal and Sakhalin, otherwise only through pipes to Europe. So Russia is much more dependent on Europe than Europe is on Russia with regard to gas. And then we have LNG today. At least 2/3 of the LNG terminal capacity in Europe is not used. So there's a massive overcapacity. And on top of that, LNG production in all kinds of countries, Qatar, Australia, Russia, and the US, is now increasing very fast. So there will be overcapacity of LNG, and there's overcapacity of gas. So if you want to deal with gas, you should be a consumer, not a producer. Right. That's a simple conclusion I draw from this. And why has it turned out like this? Well, I happened to look up on the numbers for Ukraine yesterday. In 1991, Ukraine imported 98 BCM. Last year, Ukraine imported 12 BCM, a decline of 88%. So this is how much you can save energy. And if you move over to Europe, from 2005 to 2015, the general forecast was that Europe would use 50% more gas for the reasons that Rick so rightly mentioned. In fact, consumption decreased by 20%. gas had a bigger role, but Europe is very good at saving energy, and so is Eastern Europe nowadays because of higher energy prices, because of a different industrial structure than was the case. So Europe will not need much gas. LNG is today the price setter, and the situation looks pretty good in general, as soon as we don't change too much. Thank you.
I would like to follow the suggestion from the Ambassador Bert to consider geoeconomic arguments, not just geopolitical arguments. And in this respect, the situation, for example, with Germany's support for Nord Stream 2 is very simple. So Germans, they want to have gas cheaper, basically, than other European countries. One of the probably clients of Ambassador Bert is Wintershall. It's basically a subsidiary of BASF. BASF is a huge chemical company out of Germany. They consume more gas than the whole Denmark consumes. And for them, basically, having cheaper gas than in the neighboring, I don't know, Czechia or Austria or France or Italy means a competitive advantage, basically. And killing all the competitors is as easy as that. Of course, if we add some kind of geopolitical angle, again, Germany also wants to have a so-called balance of power. That's their very old idea, and they want to basically somehow counterbalance the US as a global power. By the way, this project, Nord Stream 2, the narrative basically currently in Germany is that it's an anti-American project. It's not basically an anti-Ukrainian project or whatever, it's anti-American project. So majority of Germans support this project exactly for the reason because they believe it challenges the US. And basically your clients apparently, deliberately or not basically, but they're supporting this anti-American sentiment and this anti-American project, again, in Germany. And of course, by the way, there is some logic to it. It is an anti-American project. And today we have filed a competition law complaint to the European Commission, where with the best European experts and the best European lawyers, we substantiate basically that in fact Nord Stream 2 is a so-called predatory investment that prevents the new entry to Europe. And we, for example, look at the situation of US LNG exporters and their investment decisions, and they realize that by creating overcapacity in Europe, basically, for transporting gas to Europe, Russia can win any price war, and that prevents them from building, for example, more LNG export terminals. So it's economics 101. That basically by creating this excess capacity, you prevent new entry. That's what they do, and that's what we show in our competition law complaint to the European Commission. Again, speaking of this geopolitical argument, geoeconomic argument, again, the clients of Mr. Bert or Ambassador Bert also, again, they just want to earn more money, but their problem is that they cannot openly say that they support an anti-American project. They support a project that would kill, for example, to a large extent, Ukrainian economy, because if there is no transit, it means minus 4% of Ukrainian GDP. It means that the next year we will have recession in Ukraine. Germany also understands it. So what they do, they come up with some excuses, you see. So for example, for Nord Stream 2 and for continuing to do what they're doing now. And they say, okay, so we will have a solution. There will be a trilateral kind of process that would guarantee some volumes to Ukraine. And nothing is happening. Russia is basically just laughing at it. They don't even call it negotiations. So the European Commission and Germans say, like, we have a very constructive negotiation. That's why, please don't interfere. Let us build Nord Stream 2. And because of us building Nord Stream 2, we now have an opportunity, for example, to make Russians negotiate in good faith on transit. It's a joke. They basically, I'm taking part in all these negotiations, basically. And I met with Mr. Altmaier. We discussed all this stuff. But what Russians are saying that, look, let's not call it even negotiations. It's consultations. And negotiations can start only, basically, if Naftogaz gives up our right to get $2.8 billion from Gazprom as a result of the previous arbitration. And even then, they will be ready to negotiate only about the extension of the current contract that is not based on EU law, that provides no guarantees in terms of volumes, and that will allow basically Russians and Germans and your clients to say as early as in 1st of January 2020, sorry guys, but no volumes.
Okay, Rick, I'll give you a chance to respond, but Ogden has not spoken in a little bit.
Well,
Sure.
I'd say, as we keep saying that, Europe is stronger as a whole than Russia in these current gas conditions. And here I really want to point out that, yes, if we look at Europe as a whole, but what Gazprom has been doing and what this policy of, energy diplomacy has been doing is really to fracture and divide Europe. And indeed, if you look at any of the countries that import gas from Russia, on their own, they're always in a weaker position. So with these efforts, and of course we know Gazprom exports not only gas, it exports also corruption. So with these tools in hand, it's easier to divide up the European countries and even domestically with the different states in question. And coming to Germany, Germany is Europe's largest gas market. It's the largest importer of natural gas, and it's in fact the largest market for Gazprom. And isn't it surprising that still, until this day, that Germany still does not have an LNG import terminal, when neighboring countries like Poland or Lithuania have built, and of course other Western European countries have long ago built LNG import terminals? It's because of these long-term relationships that have been established with Gazprom. And of course now there are discussions that, well, maybe an LNG terminal will be built in the future, or they'd be open to one. But that would be only after probably Nord Stream 2 is completed. And again, as you mentioned, that demand for gas has already been met with the pipeline project.
Rick?
Well, again, I just want to remind you that economics are at work here. And people are going to buy gas from the cheapest source. And that's true for Germany or any other country. I think that my understanding is there are really 2 LNG facilities now under construction in Germany. And I think in order to get optionality, there could well be more. But I think it's wrong to kind of think about this as either or, LNG versus a pipe gas. You got to look at the specific economics and where the LNG, what the cost is, and where companies can make money buying this. Because in strategically, I think in the long run, we're going to increasingly, not just Germany, but all the Europeans are going to have more choice. There are just so many choices that they can make in terms of diversifying supply. So let's go back to Gazprom and Russia for a second. These will really be my final remarks. If you really, I think how you manage this issue and how you think about it, to sort of quote Henry Kissinger, it should be based on what is it you want to achieve and what is it you want to avoid. If what you want to achieve is stamping out corruption worldwide, whether it's in Russia because of Gazprom, or in Nigeria, or in Saudi Arabia, or in Venezuela with PDVSA, all of these petrostates, that's one thing. That means you have to get internally engaged. You have to intervene in those countries, and some of those countries are going to push back against that intervention. We wanted, in the case of Russia, in the 1990s, to remake that society and to change it and to fundamentally alter it. Guess what? It didn't work very well. But if that's what you want to do, if you really think with energy your goal should be to stamp out corruption, go at it. But some people, I think, have a different goal vis-a-vis Gazprom and Russia. And John, I wouldn't throw you into this category, but maybe I will. But they want to punish Russia. Russia has been a bad actor. We don't like what Russia has done. We don't like what Russia has done in Georgia. We don't like what Russia has done in Ukraine and Crimea. And we want to hurt it. We want to hurt Russia, just like we hurt Iraq in the 1990s, because we didn't like what Iraq did, and we imposed sanctions, no-fly zones, and you can look at the consequences of what it did to the Iraqi economy and so on. So That's another goal. If that's your goal, your strategic goal is to punish Russia, then go at it. But there is, in fact, a third goal, which I thought we were talking about here, at least with the Nord Stream 2 debate, which is not to stamp out corruption in places where it's hard to stamp out, or to punish people. It was to try to reduce leverage, to not let the Russians have the capacity to influence democratic countries that are our allies in Europe. And my argument today has been that the market is giving us that opportunity, that Russia is losing leverage and Europe is gaining it.
Okay, thank you. Anders?
Thank you very much, Rick. This was exactly what I needed. I wanted to come over to worldwide corruption, where Gazprom plays a major role.
A thought leader.
I gave you the numbers in the beginning. Putin's friends have since 2004 taken out of Gazprom in the order of $10 to $15 billion a year. They have now taken out a couple of $100 billion that they are holding abroad, and they can even afford to give a little bit to Gerhard Schröder from time to time. So this is what we are talking about. This is hybrid warfare. This is a critical matter of national security. We know of a number of East European leaders that we think are bought by Russian energy interests. I can't name them, of course, because I can't prove it. They have not been sentenced in court, which would be very unlikely, since there's so much of secret offshore money around. The total Russian private money abroad is normally assessed at $800 billion, and say that 1/4 of this comes from Putin's friends that they have taken out of Gazprom. This is what we are really talking about. What will happen if we don't fight global corruption, Rick? It is that Gazprom will buy all of us. I'm not meaning us personally, but our countries. The consequence will be crony capitalism, or if you so desire, kleptocracy. Let me give you one example where we know exactly how it worked. Reuters had a wonderful series, Comrade Criminal, a few years ago, and one of the big cases was Dmitry Firtash, who was the big gas oligarch under Yanukovych. He got from Gazprom Bank a credit line of $11 billion. With this money, he went to Gazprom and bought gas cheaply, which he then exported to Ukraine and sold it at a much higher market price, making, during 4 years, only in this way, $3.7 billion. And with this money, he could finance half of President Yanukovych presidential campaign in 2010, little wonder that he won, and for the parliamentary election in 2012. It's well documented by Stephen Gray and others in Reuters, so I'm not revealing any secrets. This is how Gazprom and the Kremlin are using corrupt revenues from Gazprom as a weapon in order to defeat and control other countries. And Ukraine is just a blatant example. Thank you.
Okay, we've I think, used up all the time for the panels. We have questions. 2 points. First, identify yourself when you speak. Secondly, I know there are lots of passions in the room. We're not looking for statements. I'll cut you off. We're looking for questions. First question over here. Please identify yourself. Oh, wait, microphone. Wait for the microphone.
Thank you. Margarita, son of a Jamestown Foundation and Polygraph program. My question is the following. Nord Stream 2 Consortium just made a statement a few days ago that Europe is going to save $8 billion per year if Nord Stream 2 is built by 2020, and this is due to the lower gas prices. To what extent can Gazprom credit itself for the lower gas prices, having in mind that right now Russian gas is selling at higher price compared to the average import price of gas in Europe. Second,
Just one question.
I just
Basta.
wanted to ask you about the 100 billion BCM, 100 BCM spare capacity that Russia has without Nord Stream and Turkish Stream right now.
Okay, Rick, you want to take a shot at this, the question?
Well, you know, I really depend on on hanging around some of these European gas executives. The thing I think the problem is, and I've heard this argument about Nord Stream 2 a lot, and I think it has to do with any pipeline, is if you look at the average flow through of a pipeline, you end up with 40 or 50%. But if you think about it, you don't build a pipeline for the average demand. You build a pipeline for maximum demand. You build a pipeline so that you can supply people with gas in January and February. And that's just, I'll remind you, some of you who follow these issues will remember last month there was a big, embarrassing scandal when Russian gas was delivered to Boston because there was a gas shortage because it was so cold. And so what if you're building pipelines, you have to build them for maximum demand, not average demand. So yes, I mean right now Nord Stream 1 probably is delivering is probably 40-50% full, but you need again to take into account that maximum demand.
Thank you.
Nord
Yuri?
Stream 1 is basically used to now to a full extent, sometimes even higher than 100%. But if you look at the Ukrainian GTS, Ukrainian gas transmission system, we have a capacity of roughly 150 BCM per year, and the Gazprom uses only about half of it, or slightly more. So it's more than enough to cover all the peaks, basically, in Europe in terms of their consumption without Nord Stream 2, just with Ukrainian gas transmission system. Actually, the full capacity of Ukrainian gas transmission system has never been utilized yet. So we have some spare capacity even to cover the highest peaks in European consumption. Speaking of the in this potential savings of $8 billion, again, actually, as I mentioned it's from the very beginning, when you listen to Russians or to Russian partners, unfortunately, they export not just corruption, basically, but lie. You need to understand that they are, in fact, are intended to do the opposite. So, as I mentioned, only because of U.S. shale revolution and U.S. LNG, when the U.S. instead of importing gas, basically, started to exporting gas, only because of that, basically, European prices decreased. So Europe already saved hundreds of billions of dollars because of the US, not because of Gazprom. Gazprom is not very happy. Gazprom is very unhappy about that. Clients of Ambassador Bert are very unhappy about that, but that's the fact that, again, Europeans save their money because of the US. And as I mentioned, basically, Nord Stream 2 is a predatory investment. So it will limit construction of new LNG export terminals in the US. It means that less gas will be coming to the European market. It will mean less competition. They also basically make Ukrainian gas transmission system stranded. So then there will be no capacity of the Ukrainian gas transmission system available to transport gas to Europe because Ukraine won't be able to maintain the gas transmission system that is empty. It will mean basically that there will be less gas coming to Europe, and Europe will be fully dependent on Russian gas supplies, meaning also high prices. So unfortunately, again, just to summarize, when Russians and again Gazprom partners are saying like, let the market decide, it basically means that they will fight fiercely against the market and they will abuse their dominant market position. When they say basically that gas will be cheaper, it means that gas will be more expensive.
Let me just say for the record, I want to make sure our Ukrainian friend understands this, but the Western companies working on Nord Stream 2 are the largest exporters of American LNG to Europe. So they're not complaining. They're happy. As I said before, the largest exporter of American LNG to Europe is Engie. And 4 of those 5 companies are fully engaged and involved in that business. They think it's a great business. They also think Nord Stream 2 is a great business.
Yeah, Margarita, you probably know the numbers, but let me just take it for the whole audience. So the current Russian export to the European Union is about 130 BCM. The Ukrainian system alone, as Jurek said, can take 150 BCM. It's enough. And currently it's used to 80 to 90 BCM per year. Then we have a Polish-Belarusian pipe, which can take 20 BCM, which is fully used. Nord Stream 1 takes 55 BCM. Nord Stream 2 would have the same capacity, so we would have 110 BCM there. So the Polish-Belarusian pipe plus Nord Stream could take all the current Russian gas exports. And then we have a Turkish stream. I don't recall exactly if it's 15 BCM or something like that. So that can take it all. The Ukrainian is not necessary. With regard to seasonality, Ukraine has massive storage tanks of 36 BCM in western Ukraine, which are fully usable and are used as is necessary, and they are normally filled in the summer and then emptied in the winter. So there's no economic need for Nord Stream 2. This is to throw the money into the water, and who benefits, who wants more than twice as much as is necessary. Timchenko, Boris Rotenberg and Arkady Rotenberg, who get half of the money for this that is being built.
Rick, you want to say
John,
something?
yeah, I just want to say, I mean, I think that I don't want to throw these statistics around, and I'm sure, you know, when thinking about these issues and these investments, you can't think just about current requirements. I've got an estimate right here. I mentioned Engie, but their estimates are, as you look out, and especially when you build these LNG terminals or these pipelines, you're talking about projects that can take 10 years or more in some cases. But if you look at their projections for European gas demand in 2030, you're talking about a supply gap of 400 BCM. That is a lot of gas. And that is dependent, I want to remind you, on two things. One, the fact that indigenous supplies of gas in Europe are rapidly declining. And two, it assumes a gradual increase, not a huge increase, but a gradual increase in gas consumption based on replacing other energy sources. So you have to take that gap into account in thinking about whether existing infrastructure, with or without the Ukraine, is going to be adequate.
Here I have to note that there are also very different forecasts for Europe's gas demand. Many economists believe, and there have been studies done in Europe and the US, that in fact Europe's gas supply demand has plateaued and it is not expected to increase at all. In fact, because of Europe's decades, well, this is, you know...
This is very little increase. It's assuming a decline in the indigenous. Your book, you're right. I stand corrected.
So essentially, in Europe, we've had decades of energy efficiency policies, policies favoring renewables, and on the back of that, again, gas demand is not expected to increase.
Let's go to the next question. Okay. All right. Over here. No, come here.
Thank you. Alan Riley, Atlantic Council. I just want to come back on this issue to do with demand. I mean, there is a joke in Brussels that the European Commission's projections of European gas demand since 1980 have always been wrong. They've always over-projected the amount of gas demand, and resolutely gas demand has been lower. And the problem, I think, first of all, is the idea that Nord Stream 2 can provide any extra gas is a bit absurd, because the whole point of Nord Stream 2 is that it is a diversionary pipeline moving gas from the Ukrainian pipeline network into Nord Stream 2. So it's not actually going to deal with this any extra gas. It's not going to provide any extra gas to Western Europe. In fact, it's going in the wrong direction. The Eugal pipeline, which is the main connecting pipeline, takes it eastward. So it's not even going in the right direction for Western Europe anyhow. But the core point, and Agni is right on this, and it is even more reinforced by all the stats over the last decade, is that the ongoing European investment in renewables and the European investment in efficiency, which originally was a West European thing, but has now also become a Central and Eastern European thing, is rapidly pushing down the amount of gas, potential gas use. And one of the things which I have said to Gazprom, and again and again and again, which they don't get, is that if you go around building things like Nord Stream 2 and threatening various European countries with threats of gas supply cutoffs, what you do is you encourage that switch to renewables, you encourage use of alternative supplies. So all of this is actually undermining your market and undermining your future and actually creating a move again away from gas. And I say also this, Ambassador Burt, is when you're hinting at or indicating, as so many other Gazprom lobbyists have, of the what can I put it, the potential of no more gas coming through Ukrainian transit in January 2020. What I do not think Gazprom realizes is that they are destroying their own market. It'll make it much more likely that in future you don't use any gas at all, or you're going to use US LNG. And you know, the thing about renewables in all of this now is the collapse in price in renewables makes it much easier to go in that direction. So renewables, efficiency and LNG puts actually real question marks over Gazprom having any role, future significant role in the European gas supply. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Rick, you want to respond?
Look, I'm quite sure the bureaucrats in the EU have made mistakes about forecasting gas need. I don't really pay much attention to those guys. I tend to be market driven and believe business people who have to serve their shareholders and have to invest real money and are going to be very careful and very prudent and think strategically. And I know all of the people I talk to believe that through 2030, 2040, until alternatives really come on stream in a major way, they see a big market for gas. That just happens to be, I think, the consensus view. As for Gazprom, I mean, you may be right. I think Gazprom is, as Anders has pointed out, is not only probably corrupt. As I said, I don't know much about Gazprom, but I don't think they're very smart. And what you've said, if they were to cut off, I'm not here to defend Gazprom, were they cut off supplies to Ukraine, that would probably create a backlash. I acknowledge all of that again, but I think what we need to worry about is really the topic here. I think the central topic is Gazprom able now to leverage its supply of gas strategically and economically vis-a-vis Europe, and I think in the past it clearly has been a major factor, but it is a declining factor thanks to the energy revolution.
First of all, I remember vividly basically the similar discussion and when Nord Stream 1 was built, with the promises that it will cover some additional demand in Europe. And when it was built, basically, the only thing that we saw a drop in transit through Ukraine. So again, no reasonable business person would invest money in a new pipeline when the existing pipelines are underutilized. They have never been utilized to a full extent. And again, for the next at least 10 years or whatever, 15 years, there is no realistic scenario assuming that there will be some lack of capacity. And as Mr. Astlund mentioned, again, Gazprom is not, in this particular sense, like a proper company, basically, that is driven by shareholder value. And even your clients are not basically driven, I mean, maybe they're driven by the shareholder value, but that's exactly the reason why they're exiting gas. So you're talking about them so being like excited about, for example, US LNG and gas sector in general. It's not the case, basically. Energy changed their name, and if you look at their basically even like marketing, they prefer not to mention gas. They're exiting their gas assets. BASF is being sold basically, or Wintershall is being sold basically to Russians, to Alpha. And then E.ON is basically complaining, and Uniper, they're complaining about, again, gas as a business. They also they need basically to limit their operations. Maybe they like US LNG just because they need to have it in their portfolio. But because it's an efficient market, you can't earn some monopolistic rent on this. Unlike with the Russian gas, when you help Gazprom to abuse the dominant market position in Europe. So basically, to cut the long story short, and I don't personally believe in this story about increasing demand or even flat demand, but with an decrease in consumption and an increase for imported gas. It's basically just an excuse to build Nord Stream 2, to strand basically Ukrainian gas transmission system, to have this anti-American project basically in the heart of Europe, helping this anti-American sentiment in the whole European Union. That's what Russians want, that's what Russians need basically urgently right now. And it also helps to divide and conquer Europe, as it was mentioned here.
Okay. Question over here. Oh, you'll get a chance to...
Well, no, I just say that I'm afraid that I would, if pushed on this, and I don't want to go, I want to make this a happy, open, free exchange, but I would argue that some of the previous arguments are in fact in the long term strategically anti-Ukrainian. I think you're making a big mistake in arguing that Ukraine deserves this political exception. I think Ukraine, if it wants to be a successful economy and transit country, needs to probably do a better job developing its own energy resources, do a better job dealing with the problem of corruption, and not blame its problems only on Russia and Gazprom. I think you are in danger of making an anti-Ukrainian argument.
We don't want any concessions. For example, as I mentioned, we're filing a competition law complaint. All we want is a level playing field. All we want basically is that Europe is serious about stopping basically the continuing abuse of the dominant market position by Gazprom. All we want is European terms, for example, in respect of the transit or energy sector in Ukraine. All we want basically is to stop Gazprom exporting corruption to Ukraine, to stop basically Russia having oligarchs like Firtash, for example, destroying our country. And of course, we want our Western partners to stop helping bad actors like you mentioned yourself, and bad oligarchs basically like was mentioned here, to ruin Ukraine. Because it's good, for example, to say that Ukraine needs reforms, Ukraine needs to fight corruption, but at the same time to help exactly the same people who are basically making this corruption happen in Ukraine.
Well, I've met some Ukrainian oligarchs, and what's interesting is they all complain about Russian oligarchs. So there's kind of an interesting tension there.
Yeah, I'm Rick Rowden from Global Financial Integrity. We do research on illicit flows going in and out of countries. Just to switch gears here, my question is about the China-Russia relationship. My understanding is that there's a couple of large pipeline projects that are apparently near completion or maybe already completed, or I'm not sure, I think one is delayed. But there are projections that Russia should be selling more gas to China in the next year or two than to Germany. And I want to know, does that mesh with your understanding, or is that accurate? Or what do you think are the implications of that relationship? Thanks.
The amazing thing is that Russia has, during many years, missed the Chinese market. And the reason is that Gazprom is a very conservative organization. Gazprom does one thing. It pipes gas, floating gas to Europe. Gazprom has been very late with LNG. It has completely ignored shale gas, probably for good reason, because very cheap gas. And they have ignored other markets. So twice, first in 97, 98, and then in 2008, 2009, Gazprom stopped taking gas from Turkmenistan. So, and Turkmenistan, that essentially only produces gas, was then in dire straits. What you do? First, in 98, they built a small pipeline to Iran, which of course has lots of gas, but not in that area. And then the Chinese built a big pipeline of 30 BCM, which came on stream, let me see, 2009, I think. And after that, Russia has almost been cut off from Turkmenistan. They just restored some relations with Turkmenistan, some purchases of gas from Turkmenistan after many years. And this Siberia, the power of Siberia pipeline, which is supposed to go to China. It was like this. Putin and Xi Jinping agreed on it on the 31st of May 2014. And after that, two things happened. The first was that the oil price, and therefore also the gas price, collapsed. So the Chinese lost interest in it. And the second thing that happened was in July 2014, the Western financial sanctions hit Russia. And the four big Chinese state banks that had been supposed to deliver $25 billion in loan to this project said nothing doing, because all of us also have business in the United States. We are not interested in being sanctioned by the United States. So therefore, there was no financing. And Russia has then gone ahead and financed this on its own, because this is for a valuable project which is carried out by, you guess whom, Timchenko and Rotenberg. So therefore it had to be carried out at the expense of Gazprom's very substantial cash flow. And the Russians first wanted it to be an LNG terminal in Vladivostok. The Chinese said, no, we want to have gas coming to us. The Russians then wanted it to be from the West Siberian gas fields. The Chinese said, no, we want it to be from East Siberian gas fields in Yakutia and Osaka. And that's what happened, which means that China decides the price. So Russia lost on all accounts what kind of project it was, what fields that were used, and where it would go, and therefore it will also lose on price. As far as I know, the price has not been set. So this really shows what a junior partner Russia has become to China, and it has failed to do something else. Otherwise, they could have LNG that also could have been sold to South Korea and Japan. Now they're simply stuck with one customer that can settle the terms.
Okay, other questions? Oh, wait, okay.
Just briefly, but nonetheless, this, I think, determination of Russia and Gazprom to access the Chinese market stems from their realization, in fact, that their position is weakening in Europe and that gas demand there is, has plateaued at best. This pipeline, the Power of Siberia, will start, launch end of this year. Again, not on the terms that Russia wanted. For China, they will buy gas in a variety of ways, from Central Asia via LNG, from the United States and Australia and Qatar and so on. They also have a pipeline going from Myanmar, so they have a variety of options. But for Russia, they really hope that they could set off some of their losses in Europe with their turn towards China.
Over there first.
Jordan McGillis, Institute for Energy Research. We sometimes in this discussion act as if Russia and Gazprom are interchangeable, but some commentators argue that there are rifts between the Kremlin and Gazprom and that they might be losing favor, especially in light of companies like Novatek that are perhaps emerging. Can our panelists comment on that issue?
It looks as if Novatek, which is owned primarily by Leonid Mikhelson and Gennady Timchenko, that it's strongly in favor. Novatek has now about 2/3 of the market value of Gazprom, being a much smaller company. Novatek is well run, unlike Gazprom. And a few years ago, LNG became permissible for export also by other companies than Gazprom. And that was to the benefit both of Rosneft and of Novatek. It's been long speculated whether Novatek would get the right to export pipe gas to Europe also. So clearly Gazprom is extremely poorly managed. I would say that the real CEO of Gazprom is Vladimir Putin. And Alexei Miller is just a stand-in for him. In order to manage this situation, Putin has at least 3 different factions within the leadership of Gazprom. And such a big company cannot function well in that. So if you take other big Russian companies, they are run by a dictatorial CEO, not so Gazprom. And therefore Gazprom is uncommonly dysfunctional as a company. And this has been all the time, and it continues. And this is because it suits Putin, because he can keep control. And amazingly, he doesn't seem to care much about the economic result that comes out of it.
You know, just one little footnote on sort of the unintended consequences of sanctions. As some of you may know, there is a sanctions bill in the Congress called DASCA, and one of its provisions would sanction, including secondary sanctions, energy projects outside of Russia that Russian companies are participating in. There is a LNG facility now under development in Rostock in Germany where Novatek is an investor. And that would, under DASCA, any company that was participating in the construction of that LNG terminal could be sanctioned, meaning that it would create barriers to importing American LNG to Germany. So certainly not the purpose of the legislation.
From my experience, and as it was mentioned, I have some experience in terms of negotiating and litigating against Gazprom. Gazprom is controlled by Kremlin, and again, Miller just listens basically to what Putin says. Also, you can see basically, you can look at the leadership of Nord Stream 2, Nord Stream in general, and you can see that they're all Putin's friends, not Miller friends. Again, I'm talking about Schroeder, or this guy from Stasi, Matthias Warnig, again, Putin's comrade, or how they call them. But there will be a test, by the way, if Novatek, for example, will be allowed to have its part of the pie. As I mentioned, we have filed this competition law complaint, and one of the remedies in this complaint is to force the DG Competition, European Antitrust Authority, they should force Gazprom to allow swaps, basically, with independent gas producers. So as you know, Gazprom enjoys a pipeline export monopoly. Again, just another very anti-competitive measure by the Russian Federation when they just want to control basically the whole market in Europe. Nothing to do with let the market decide. But then we're saying that, at least in the Russian law, nothing prevents Gazprom from doing the swaps with independent gas producers, like, for example, Novatek, meaning that Novatek will give gas to Gazprom in Russia, and Gazprom will give it gas back on the Ukrainian-Russian border, for example, after exiting Russia. So we hope that the European Commission will be serious about that, so there will be some push from the side of the European Commission as the largest basically consumer of Russian gas. But also, again, there will be a test for Novatek if they can get some political support inside Russia so that it's not blocked.
I'm afraid our time is up. I see we still have some questions, but we're going to have another session in 15 minutes. So if that begins on time, we will adjourn here. And I'd like to thank our panel for a very interesting conversation.
Thank you for those of you that stuck around for the second panel or are just joining us now. My name is Shelby Magid. I'm an assistant director with the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, and we are going to continue this conversation looking at the, as we know, controversial Nord Stream 2 pipeline. In this panel, we'll be looking at the political debate and remaining challenges, particularly examining some of the implications for European energy security, Ukraine's energy and general security, and U.S.-European relations. I have the pleasure of introducing our panelists. We have Ambassador Richard Morningstar, the founding chairman of the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center with a lengthy and esteemed career in Eurasian energy affairs. Mr. Dag Njaland, hopefully I said it right, a partner at Wickberg Rhine in Norway and a lead counsel for Naftagaz, and two of our senior fellows from the Global Energy Center, doctors and professors Alan Riley and Brenda Schaefer. So we'll have the panel discussion and then Q&A, so please think of some questions. And we'll start with Ambassador Morningstar just giving us some of the big picture look, and then I'd ask our panelists to respond to the previous panel if there's anything they'd like to add.
Well, thank you very much, Shelby, and I'll try to do that and give somewhat of a big picture look, but also in doing that, I think really have to respond to some extent to the earlier panel, which I thought was a very good and constructive discussion. Some of you may know I historically have been a Nord Stream hawk. I still don't like Nord Stream very much, but at the same time, I'm trying my best to be somewhat objective with respect to the issues. We received a major grant from the Smith Richardson Foundation on European energy security and looking at how the United States can most constructively engage with Europe. And so I've looked at the issues, been looking at the Nord Stream issues very, very closely over the past couple of months. One thing I would say right at the outset is that as much of Nord Stream as an issue and is a subject of this discussion today, we don't pay anywhere near enough attention to Turkish Stream. And in my view, from a Europe standpoint, Turkish Stream may even be more dangerous than Nord Stream. And the reason that I say that is that Turkish Stream could, if completed and without very specific conditions under the third energy package, could basically seriously impede alternative supplies of gas coming into southern Europe, whether it be LNG from expansion of the southern gas corridor, the Eastern Med, the KRG, and I was in Greece recently and made the argument to Greece, who was sort of neutral on Turkish Stream. They'd sort of like to be the transit country. So this is the last thing you would ever want, because if you want to be a transit hub, you're just not going to be a transit hub, or it's going to be very difficult if Turkish Stream takes place. So that's what I'll say about Turkish Stream. But please don't forget about that as we talk about Nord Stream. As we look at the Nord Stream issue, I think it has to be looked at very closely from two perspectives or through two lenses. It has to be looked at through a Europe lens, and it has to be looked at through a Ukraine lens. And both are critically important. And from a Europe standpoint, what I think is critical is that whatever happens with respect to Nord Stream, everything has to be done to ensure and to help ensure, which we can help, that Europe have a transparent and competitive energy market. Again, whatever happens with Nord Stream, and whatever happens with Nord Stream, that Russia be forced under European laws and directives and regulations to act in a transparent and competitive way. Now, some people think Europe's done nothing. I think that's unfair. Europe has done a lot of stuff. There still needs to be done, but they've made progress on interconnections, on reverse flow, on developing LNG. I think the amendments on the gas directive, if particularly the Commission and hopefully Germany take it seriously, can have a real impact on the effect of a Nord Stream 2. There's a lot of litigation that Alan can talk about, and I'm sure will talk about, that could have serious ramifications with respect to Nord Stream 2. The reactions in Europe to the United States I find interesting. I've talked to a lot of people, and even those in Europe who really don't like Nord Stream are saying, but it would be really concerned if the U.S. enacted sanctions. And we haven't talked that much about sanctions. But that is the view of even among many of the opponents of Nord Stream in Europe. And what they keep saying to me is you have to work with us, the United States, in order to deal with the issue, and don't screw it up by enacting sanctions. Now, part of that assumes that Europe can make progress, and that is something that the United States can play, I think, a constructive role. I might also say that I think that given that Europe has, I think, made some progress, there is a real question how much of that is a result of the threat of U.S. sanctions and the uncertainty of the risk of U.S. sanctions. And we had a roundtable, a Chatham House roundtable, so I can't attribute anything to anybody, but that question came up. Well, do you think that maybe you're doing some of these things because of the threat of sanctions? And it wasn't denied. Let's put it that way. So the uncertainty, whether or not sanctions are useful, the uncertainty of sanctions can maybe help push things in the right direction in Europe to make it so that even Gazprom is more transparent and competitive. I agree with one statement that was made earlier. LNG is not an either-or issue. Today, American LNG, if you listen to the American LNG companies, is competitive in Europe. And they're selling LNG in Europe, and they're selling a lot of it now. And in fact, the prices in Europe are even better than Asia at the moment. And that they feel that Europe is a very real market. And one can say, well, Russia can lower the prices, force prices down so that LNG can't compete. Say two things about that. Well, at least the gas would be at a good price. And second, I've spent a good part of my life in business, and I can tell you, we would never have one source of supply with respect to a key product. And I think companies and countries, and I think you're seeing it with even the German companies, that will pay a premium for optionality and will pay some kind of security premium to make sure that there are dual sources of supply. So that's very briefly looking at it through a Europe lens. But that doesn't answer the Ukraine problem. And the reason that I had always been very vocal, even certainly more vocal than I'm sounding today, about Nord Stream 2 is it just in my gut, and I think that's a real feeling here in the United States, that after what, and can talk about punishment or not punishment, but the fact is, should Russia be allowed new pipelines, which would be a detriment to Ukraine after Russia's behavior? I think that is a legitimate question. And I think that it's a very legitimate issue as to how Ukraine can be protected in this situation. Now, there's talk of those sort of some in the prior panel poo-pooed negotiations and so forth. I think there's supposed to be a negotiation at the end of this month, trilateral negotiation. And it's up to the Europeans to be serious about it. And it's up to Germany, I think, to step up to the plate with respect to possibly coming to some kind of deal with respect to Nord Stream. Now you have the problem, how do you enforce it? And that's been the complaint. Well, if there's a deal, then yeah, they'll never comply. Well, you can have binding contracts, in which we've seen issues plus and minus with respect to the arbitrations. There's been some talk, I'm not sure how it would work, of some kind of contingent sanctions. You know, if transit got below a certain amount and if Ukraine was acting in good faith, maybe then sanctions could go into effect. I'm getting the look from Shelby to stop. But so whether or not a compromise or an agreement is possible, I'm not sure. But that's sort of my basic overview, but to really need to look at it from a Europe standpoint and from a Ukraine standpoint.
Thank you, Ambassador Morningstar, and we will loop back to the issue of sanctions. In the meantime, Dr. Riley, was there anything you wanted to respond to from the previous panel?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things was raised was this concept of punishment of Gazprom. And I think the way to look at it, I think, is the other way around. It's Gazprom punishing Central Eastern European states, punishing Ukraine. I mean, there's a great piece of work by a Swedish researcher called Robert Larsson for the Swedish Defence Research Agency, which came out in about 2006, which lists about 40 politically motivated energy cut-offs in oil and gas, largely gas, organised by Gazprom between 1991 and 2004. So 40 politically motivated cut-offs. That's before we talk about the 06 and 09 cut-offs. Before we talk about 2014, 2015, when gas was being sent on reverse flow to Ukraine, first of all, Gazprom threatens Poland, Hungary and Slovakia with reduced supplies if they don't stop. When they don't stop, they actually seek to reduce the amount of gas to them. So the concern about Gazprom is the fact that it is punishing others. It's not merely threats, it's actual actions, of which a lot of Europeans have experienced. Europeans in the EU or Europeans in Ukraine, they've all experienced this. And as Yuri said, some people have died in very cold winters as a result. So this is the punishment. It's not Gazprom being punished. It's actually how you go around protecting yourself from Gazprom. And that is what a lot of the European discussion is about. And that's one of the reasons I also think why the reaction against Nord Stream 2 is so strong. When you think about it, given that context which I've just described, can you imagine that in June of 2015, without no reference to any of the Central Eastern European states whatsoever, or talking to the Commission, Putin announces he's going to build this new pipeline? No reference whatsoever. And that's why you got so many member states opposing it. Why, in fact, in February of this year, you had a situation with the amendment to the gas directive, which came into force, which we can talk about, but that was supported by at least 22 of the 28 member states. And Germany was facing the position when France switched sides of losing completely. So Germany, despite it notionally being the most powerful state in Europe, was not able to put a blocking minority together and was faced with being defeated on a straight down vote in the European Council, which almost never happens. Now that is an indication of the level of European antipathy and European concern about Nord Stream 2 and Gazprom's power in the region and in Europe as a whole. I think that should not be underestimated.
Thank you. Dr. Schaefer, would you like to respond?
2 points. One, essentially Germany does have access to LNG without physically having LNG import facilities because of the interconnection with the Netherlands. It actually does consume LNG of this, and so it's not that you have to wait until the facilities are built in Germany. It actually already does import LNG through the Netherlands. And a second point that whatever happens, whether it's on Nord Stream 2, on Ukraine, it's essential that there's U.S.-German cooperation. There's essential that the U.S.-German, there's no way that the relationship is so essential if we're going to have any success vis-a-vis Russia. And in fact, the only the main country that benefits from a spat between Germany and the United States is Russia. And I think that we have to make sure whatever the policy is, that it in no way hurts the alliance between Germany and the United States.
Thank you. Mr. Mjalland?
Yes. Perhaps I would first like to address a couple of issues from the previous panel, as you suggested, and to put the record straight in terms of Russian domination in gas markets in Europe. I think Ambassador Bert referred to only 9% of German energy needs being made up by Russian gas. But if we are looking at gas markets, then it's clear that the Russian share of the German gas market has been growing lately, and that applies also to other parts of Europe, which means that in Germany we are now closer to 60% of German needs being fulfilled by Russian gas, and generally speaking in European gas markets, Russian gas covers approximately 50%, which gives under competition law a presumption, a rebuttable presumption of dominance. I think that's important numbers to keep in mind when we talk about Russia's and Gazprom's role in Europe, and in particular how Gazprom abuses this dominance. Then I would also like to address another issue that was discussed by Ambassador Bert, and which you, Ambassador Morningstar, also referred to, and that is Germany's role in this situation, in particular in terms of future Ukrainian transit. Now, Ambassador Bert alluded to various contacts between the German government and the Russian government, and that allegedly led to a change in Russian position in terms of a more positive attitude towards Russian transit through Ukraine. I think this is all based on a huge misunderstanding, because it's been clear, I think, to Naftogaz from the negotiations with the Russians. It's been clear to me and my team as counsel to Naftogaz that there is nothing in these indications. As Yuri pointed out clearly, Gazprom has made it a condition for continued transit that Naftogaz forgoes its wins in the previous arbitrations. That is, that the outcome essentially of the previous arbitrations, where Naftogaz was successful, be reversed. And when Russian politicians speak about transit through Ukraine on commercial terms, what they mean by commercial terms is something very peculiar, because it is precisely this reversal of the outcome of the arbitration. It has nothing to do with regular commercial terms. And so this is all totally misleading. Germany has to face up to the fact that they are being duped by the Russians. They have to accept that when the Russians talk about commercial terms, it is what I said, it's an attempt at reversing the outcome of the arbitrations. And of course, we stand ready to explain this in further detail to the Germans if they need more details about it.
Thank you.
Just briefly to respond to that, and I don't disagree with what you're saying. I think it would be extremely difficult to come to an agreement. I think that negotiations will take place, and that there needs to be some kind of threat that is part of those negotiations as to what happens if Ukraine isn't protected. I think that there's what has not come up yet, and what I think is really interesting, and I know there was some concern in Europe, is what happens at the end of the year when Nord Stream 2 isn't ready, because with the Danish issue on the routes, on other issues, it may well be that it'll be sometime after the first of the year that Nord Stream 2 even could be ready. And then what happens? What does Russia do? Or Gazprom, and I know we keep going back and forth between Gazprom and Russia, but what in fact do they do? Do they play hardball and say, well, okay, we have no agreement, so therefore, there's going to be no transit? That would be a very risky move. There's also a question, what does Ukraine do in that situation? And does that give Ukraine any leverage at that point? And it's at least something to think about.
But then you are assuming that there is no agreement.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sure.
Yes, and of course that's a situation that could arise. But but in that situation, it's fully possible for Gazprom to book capacities in the Ukrainian transmission system with the Ukrainian TSO. So there would be no excuse for Russia not to transit gas to Europe in such a situation.
There is some indication. And again, this could be bluff, playing games, so forth. But there is evidence from a couple of European customers of Gazprom that they've been told by Gazprom, this is in the public domain, that not to expect any gas from January for up to 6 months.
Mm.
I've heard that too.
Yeah, and there was, I think Bulgar Gas was one, and they were quite open about that. Now, so one of the questions is, how likely is that? And one of the first questions is the Danish issue. And you know that in Denmark we have several routes for which Nord Stream 2 potentially could go through Danish waters. One is through the territorial sea, and that's now subject to a national security concern. It's in the territorial sea. They can block it on national security grounds if they want. And the second, and there's two other routes. One is north of the Bornholm Island, and the other is south of the Bornholm Island in the Baltic Sea. And essentially the Danish Energy Agency says it doesn't like the Nord Stream, for various environmental reasons, it doesn't like the proposed route Nord Stream 2 wants to use through the northern route. It prefers them to go around the southern route, and it's asked for more technical information about that route. And I think on Thursday, or Wednesday or Thursday of last week, the Gazprom response was to institute judicial review proceedings in the Danish courts in relation to the route, the southern route, the third route. Now, all of that is a long way round saying that there is likely to be a significant delay, because it is now May, even when legal proceedings are speedy. That would create, that's likely to create a further delay. And then there's the issue, you'd actually have to build the pipelines. And then there's the issue that you're entering into the winter period where it becomes more difficult. So the likelihood is that the pipeline it's only about 40% complete even now, because they're actually building it at the moment without actually having the permits in the Danish Sea. So with the best will in the world, if one wants to give Nord Stream 2 the best will in the world, even if one gives it the best will in the world, it's very difficult to see how it's going to get built by the 1st of January. So that then raises this question about I think practically we are in a situation where Nord Stream 2 will not be in place by 1st of January 2020. And potentially it could be much longer if the legal proceedings get entwined in appeals and so forth. So if we're looking at a longer time period, then we do have an issue. And then the question then flows from that is, what is the sort of deal that could be done with Ukraine? And then if there isn't a deal, what do we do? And what are the consequences?
Thank you. So you've addressed that we should be looking at possible scenarios. And is Europe and should Europe be preparing for gas shortages for the average customer?
So, I'm sitting next to 3 lawyers, and I'm nervous enough as it is with that, but they're being very blasé and calm about a very alarming thing that I think Shelby's question suddenly, you're hearing all these words, technical, this agreement, this. Yes, Russia and Ukraine now are playing a game of chicken, and if someone doesn't blink soon, there could be a major disruption of Russian gas to Europe. Some say Europe can accommodate it. It would just be a matter of price, and that it can. But some markets probably will be really, really challenged. And yes, I think that it's not in the interest of Ukraine or of Russia for the transit to stop, especially at this point. But I think, yes, Europe should prepare. If I think probably, whoever profits from Hungary's gas storage is probably going to become very wealthy in the future. But I think Europe definitely should prepare for the possibility that there would be a disruption of Russian gas.
Are there any particular markets within Europe we should be looking at? You've mentioned Hungary.
I think the Bulgaria is traditionally seen as the one which is the most vulnerable, simply because of it has less interconnectors than any other state. But basically, there is, if on DG Energy's website, there is a document they did stress tests, assuming there was no Russian gas or limited Russian gas available about 3 years ago. So that all the stress tests give you, and then they're slightly out of date, but they give you a good sense of where it is. Basically, the further east you go, the worse it gets. And it's really Bulgaria, which was also true in 2009, but there are some interconnectors coming online. And of course, the other issue is Ukraine. So
there's also a lot of tools that states that are either single supplied or have disruptions can use, some tools that they can apply to their energy security that we rarely, even though they're out there and they're so easy, they rarely adopt them. And even in the case when there was a major disruption, you mentioned Bulgaria, most of their heat is dual fuel plants, which is that can be gas and then over to liquid fuels. And in fact, because they were preparing, in principle, you can have a disruption of gas not just because of politics. In fact, political disruptions of gas are very rare. You often have, because of earthquakes, because of extreme weather, because of different acts of nature. You can have it because of terrorism. This week, Israel had to shut down its gas supplies from Tamar simply because of the danger of missiles from the Gaza Strip. So there could be a variety of reasons why your gas is disrupted, and you have to prepare for it. So Bulgaria had prepared with dual fuel plants, but they didn't, by law, keep liquid fuels by these dual fuel plants. And so it took them 2 weeks to procure the liquid fuels to substitute the gas, meaning that there was a way to be prepared. And there are a variety of things, whether it's plans for disruptions, which industries you disrupt, which industries you don't disrupt, extensive gas storage, dual fuel plants. There's a variety of means that countries can prepare that isn't just how to get other gas.
Ambassador Morningstar.
What this discussion shows is that the situation is just a lot more complicated than people give it credit for. And we can spout off Nord Stream's good, Nord Stream's bad, all generalities and so forth. But it's a very complicated situation. And I think this issue as to what happens on December 31st or January 1st shows that. And Gazprom can take negotiating positions that, we're not going to discuss anything that allows Ukraine to recover from the arbitration. I mean, what does that mean at this point? Maybe not a whole heck of a lot. I mean, this is a ridiculous hypothetical that's not going to happen. But if Gazprom came to Ukraine and said, forget your claim on the 2.8 billion, but we'll guarantee that you get that will transit 90 BCM of gas for the next 8 years, they're going to take that deal, obviously. I realize it's not going to happen. But what it illustrates is that, you can have negotiating positions, that there may be situations developing over the next several months for any number of reasons, including some that we've talked about, that leverage will be created. And I just don't think we should discount that. And let's see what happens. And as I said, I think Ukraine may have some leverage in all of this.
Can I also come back on one point which I think is important in this, is that last week I was at the US EU LNG conference in Brussels, and what was really interesting talking about this very issue, about the prospect of the transit contract expiring and not being replaced, is that all I can say is that every single US LNG exporter was very excited about the commercial opportunity. And the joke was that the best thing that Gazprom could do if they're going to do that is buy shares in US LNG companies, because they were all going to do very well out of it. Thank you very much. And so the sense that when discussing about the scope of the market, the availability of gas, and the prices that could work in Europe, it would seem to me that clearly one of the potential solutions is the use of a lot more LNG. And as I said earlier, one of my senses of all of this, and I've said this to Gazprom officials directly, is that if you move down this line, you will shrink your market. And I think that's and I actually suspect one of my views about this is in terms of creating deterrence from the Russians going down this line, is the more that the European customers make it clear that they're prepared to take LNG and take steps to do so, and to responding to the potential threat of no supply from January 2020, I would think it would cause, at least in Gazprom headquarters, if not in the Kremlin, a degree of pause at the prospect. As I say, they could pull the trigger of the energy weapon, and not much would happen. That would probably be worse for Gazprom than anything else.
Mr. Mjallin, did you have something to add to that?
Yes. So on the issue of potential cessation of transit, as I said, there is an option for Gazprom if the situation is that Nord Stream 2 is not up and going on 1st January. That is to book capacities in the Ukrainian gas transmission system. But then there is another issue that Ambassador Morningstar mentioned, that if Gazprom were to offer 90 BCM, no, but let's take it seriously. And then you suggested that in that case, Naftogaz Ukraine would accept it and would relinquish the 2.8 in order to get a deal. But the point is that it's not only a question about the 2.8 billion claim that Naftogaz has against Gazprom as a result of the arbitrations. So what essentially Gazprom asks is that the outcome of the arbitrations also in other respects be reversed. So, for instance, volume and take-or-pay provisions, price revision, etc. So this would be a condition that would never be accepted, at least as long as I'm Naftogaz's lead counsel.
Look, I've had. I'm now.
And just to finish about. So what would there be in this for Naftogaz going forward? Well, there is this new arbitration that is we call the reversal arbitration, because that is essentially what Gazprom seeks. But Naftogaz has also submitted counterclaims, inter alia a claim for tariff revision effective from March 2018 and until the end of the contract. And that claim is in the range of 10 to 14 billion US dollars because of impairment costs or accelerated depreciation. So Naftogaz aims to recoup what it loses, has to recoup what it loses because the system will be stranded if there is no continuation.
Look, I was talking about a hypothetical situation that probably will never happen. But having said that, the point is, I'm now in my 5th career, which shows how old I am. And I spent the first 11 years of my working career being a litigator. And what I learned during those 11 years is never to say never. I mean, parties have said, you know, I will never settle, I will never do this, I will never do that, and then it ends up that if the situation is right and if it ends up being that both parties are better off than by continuing the litigation, you can sometimes reach a resolution. I'm not saying it's going to happen here, but you know, that's all would all be part of the negotiation, and there isn't going to be any real negotiation unless the parties' backs are to the wall, and that won't happen at the earliest towards the end. You know, towards the end of this year. Maybe useless. If I had to bet in Las Vegas, I'd bet that there probably will not be a settlement, but I don't think it should be totally disregarded.
Thank you, Ambassador Morningstar. So we've addressed some of the ways that Naftogaz is trying to deal with this. I'd like to pivot us back to some of the challenges not only that we face from Nord Stream 2 and if it comes to fruition, but also challenges in how we are addressing this. Dr. Schaefer, last year you published an article in Foreign Policy in which you argued that there are several unintended consequences of the U.S. diplomatic campaign. What do you mean, and what are the results of this campaign?
So I think we really need to think about, there's one thing, what the view is, should Nord Stream 2 be built or not, but also to think about what are the unintended consequences of many of our actions with this campaign. So I couldn't concur more with Ambassador Morningstar about the danger of expansion of Turk Stream. So we've been so focused on Nord Stream 2 that Turk Stream has just been crawling into, not even crawling, maybe even running into Europe. And the implications of Turk Stream 2 and if there's 3 or 4 or even more so, are much greater a challenge to energy security. I mean, first, most of these markets that it's going to go to Russia already is a single supplier. And when we look at all the statistics about security of supply in Europe, it isn't interesting to look about Europe in general. You have to look at specific markets, and that's a number one. The discussion about the numbers in general don't mean much. Most of the markets where Turk Stream are intended to go into, Russia is already the single supplier. And these markets, because they're either landlocked countries or they're behind the Bosphorus, they can't be accessed by LNG. So, and most of them except essentially don't have access to LNG because of the lack of interconnection. So having actually an additional pipeline into Turk Stream 2 is much more dangerous than Nord Stream 2. That doesn't mean Nord Stream 2 is dangerous or not dangerous, but we should not let Turk Stream expand. Second, in the process of the EU trying to obstruct Nord Stream 2, it's like you maybe tried to solve one problem and created another. And I think the change in the gas directive midstream is a very dangerous precedent. One, the infrastructure that you've already proved, what's the signal to potential producers or pipeline builders or even existing pipelines that want to expand them, that mid-process the rules of the game can be changed. And second, substantially, extension of EU energy trade law to energy transit states is not what these laws were intended for. They actually can create so much, maybe again, I'm on a panel here with lawyers, help me out here. Maybe it creates a lot of opportunity for litigation, and this way actually many pipelines can be obstructed or expansion of existing suppliers. In Europe, it's not just about Russian supplies. If you're watching also what's happening in Algeria, a major supplier to Southern Europe, and a complete possibility of escalation of instability there that could affect both oil and gas supplies from Algeria. So we need to create conditions to bring more gas into Europe, not thinking about how to block gas. And another thing, again, this sort of open spat between Germany and the U.S. It only serves Russia. It's quite problematic.
Okay, can I come back on all of that? My first problem with that is the change of directive in midstream. Remember, the only reason why it was in midstream is that Gazprom decided, contrary to all normal business practice, to start building a pipeline when you don't have yet all the permits, which, I mean, in that case, upon its own head be it. And in any event, the point is that although the gas directive was amended to formally extend the EU's third energy package to import pipelines, the original gas directive had already been applied to two import pipelines, Yamal and to South Stream. So I think in those circumstances, I don't see how one can ever take the position other than that they had notice and they proceeded in advance of actually having all the permits in place, contrary to all normal business practice. And in that case, they really don't have a leg to stand on. In relation to Germany and the US, I think one has to also remember, and this goes back, in fact, to the amendment to the gas directive as well. As I said earlier, at least 22 member states, and actually in all, because they were faced with losing on the amendment to the gas directive, 24 of the 28 member states all supported the amendment to the gas directive. So when you talk about the German-US relationship, one has to think about the US and the other EU 24, all of whom have considerable reservations about the role of Nord Stream in Europe, and indeed the German-Russian relationship. So one of the things about this, and one of the things I find most difficult with the Germans' position, is that they are losing the support of and the confidence of so many member states. And in fact, I would kind of just say that one thing is really the level of damage that Germany is doing to itself in Europe through Nord Stream 2, and its willingness to so not take account of all of the other states' interests is quite incredible. In fact, my view now is if Brexit, we hope, does not happen, then in this decade, the country which has damaged itself more in strategic terms is not the United Kingdom, it is Germany through supporting Nord Stream 2.
Thank you. And with that, I'll turn to Ambassador Morningstar.
Putting my legal hat on, which I hate to do, and haven't for quite some time, but on that one, on this one, I have to say, we're going to pick on you, Brenda. I agree with Alan on the gas directive, and my point would be, and I think it's similar to Alan's point, is was a real dispute within the Commission as to whether the third energy package applied to offshore pipelines. And only because legal services, under the direction of the chef de cabinet to President Juncker, came out with an opinion to say that it wasn't, did this become a major issue. But it certainly had not been clear that the third energy package wouldn't apply to Gazprom. And what the amendments to the gas directive did was to ultimately come up with a compromise that would allow it to be considered, where Germany would have the first crack at the negotiation and would try and come with a deal which the Commission would either approve or disapprove. Now some say, well, they'll all chicken out, they won't do anything. I don't know. There are some very strict provisions that, could end up at the Court of Justice, but it's not, I would argue, it's not changing the rules in the middle of the game.
No, it's not. It's not. So, but the question is really what will be the effect of the application of the third energy package to Nord Stream 2. So there are three main issues, main sets of rules. That's the tariff setting, cost-reflective rules, it's unbundling, and its third-party access. And of course, Alan, we have discussed this. How can it be implemented to a pipeline like Nord Stream 2 that starts in the territory of Russia, which has an export monopoly, for instance? How would the rules on third-party access apply? I think you have posited that there would be then tentatively, say, a conflict of laws, and the question is next. Well, how can that conflict of laws be resolved? And of course, given the export monopoly, it's difficult to see that there will be other exporters of gas that will apply for third-party access, at least from the Russian side. So I think that there are many issues with these rules. Similarly, with regard to the unbundling issues, there are various options for unbundling. You could imagine hiving off the project to an independent transmission system operator, and which would allow Gazprom still to be in control. Cost-reflective tariffs without competition and transparency. It's doubtful what the effects would be. So when we considered at an earlier stage, before the amendment of the gas directive, whether it would be helpful to draw the attention of DG Energy to the issue of application of the third energy package as it was. We had some hesitations on those accounts, and that is the main reason why we decided instead to challenge the project through this competition law complaint that you mentioned, and that we submitted today, and in respect of which we think that we have a robust case that the Commission will at least initiate proper investigation and consider a statement of objections. Of course, that may take time, but there is also various possibilities while this process is going on. For instance, there is at least formally a possibility of suspending the project while the Commission considers it. So that's
that require an injunction of some kind from the Court of First Instance?
Yes, it would normally be the case. So
I'm going to interrupt the lawyers.
Yeah, but
Probably a good idea.
Yeah, but then just to conclude on this issue, you mentioned American sanctions. So what we have here is, let's say, a set of various tools. Alan, you have also mentioned the investment scrutinizing regulation in the European Union that might be used the same manner as a similar vehicle in the US. So as far as American sanctions are concerned, I think this is something that we consider now as, let's say, the ultimate tool of last resort. It's not something that we are asking for or hoping at this stage, but at the same time we have noted the repeated statements that sanctions are always available.
Thank you, Mr. Mjalen. So, Dr. Riley, you brought up Germany, and now we've brought up sanctions. So, while you have the lawyer hat, Ambassador Morningstar, I'd also like to take advantage of the transatlantic and diplomacy hat. How have we affected U.S.-German relations, and how have sanctions fit into this?
Well, you know, it certainly hasn't helped. And the question, I guess it is a question, how badly has it hurt? I think that if sanctions in fact were enacted, that would have a very serious effect on U.S.-German relations. Then the question is whether, is that worth the price? One can argue, well, there are already so many issues, what's one more issue? On the other hand, I think we have to keep our eyes on, from a Europe standpoint, what the number one goal ought to be, and that is to have a transparent and competitive market which forces Russia and Gazprom to act transparently and competitively. And so the question is, can Europe achieve that? Can we help Europe achieve that? Do we hurt that cause by sanctions? Then we also have the question of Ukraine, obviously, which I talked about before. But I would agree that it certainly shouldn't be our first choice, and there could be a lot of unintended consequences. It could be harmful, and the hope would be that Europe, possibly with our help, well, hopefully with our help, constructive cooperation, could in fact achieve what I said before. Any pro-sanctions people here? Alan, where are you on this?
I'm sanctions. Well, you know, I think there are two or three different things on sanctions. One of the points about it is that it depends what you mean by sanctions. Because remember, this when we talk about sanctions, we're not sanctioning Germany. We would be sanctioning the Nord Stream 2 project, and that could happen in a number of different ways, which you could tighten. There's levels of sanctions which could be imposed, which would not, I think, cause much political trouble. So that's one issue. The second point is this: is that I think sanctions are likely. I mean, one ends up using kind of rather black jokes about all this, but one of the black jokes I make about it is that Mr. Putin can either have Nord Stream 2 or he can interfere with the US elections, but he cannot do both. And the point behind that is that as more and more evidence comes out of Russian misbehavior, with the Willer report and other things yet to come perhaps, then it's going to be quite politically difficult for Germany or any European state to really object to more sanctions. So I think that's an issue going along this, which has effects. I think we've got two axes here. One is the fact there are things which could be sanctioned, which are not going to cause too much trouble. It depends what you're going to do. The second is there's going to be a legitimate political reason why the United States wants to impose sanctions, and to some degree, yes, Nord Stream 2 is a target. And this is my other black joke about the fact that one of the reasons why Nord Stream 2 is such a sanction target is because of Nord Stream 2's lobbying in Washington. If I'd been advising Nord Stream 2, I would have said, guys, keep away from Washington. Don't send all these people around Capitol Hill and telling them how fantastic Nord Stream 2 is and what a great project it is. Because then you go in to see a congressman in Wyoming who knows nothing about Nord Stream, doesn't know where the Baltic Sea is, never mind where Nord Stream 2 is or what it is. And you tell him about it. You say, the Russians want this. Perhaps the Russians shouldn't have it. So what you've actually done is created a significant amount of knowledge about the project and actually incentives to stop it, which wouldn't have been there if you hadn't actually bothered going around doing all that lobbying. It was incredibly counterproductive. So I think there is a sense here in which sanctions are possible and they may well happen. And the issue for the United States, in part, is to look at what it is you're going to sanction to minimize the impact on legitimate European interests.
I think that why Nord Stream 2 is a target is much bigger than, a few lobbyists coming to Washington. Nord Stream 2 has been such a lightning rod, and Nord Stream 1 as well, and always Soviet and then Russian pipelines, into Europe. It's always been a consistent U.S. policy to oppose these pipelines. Is that the reason why I think Nord Stream 2 has been such a lightning rod is because we don't have a comprehensive policy towards Russia. We have, and this started under the Obama administration. A lot of it, I think, is because of the up until now, with the Mueller investigation. But we traditionally, how you deal with a rival, with an adversary, with even a country with malign influence, is you use a large scale of sticks and carrots, and you have a comprehensive policy. Well, we heard, under the Obama administration from Secretary Kerry that we treat each issue with Russia separately. So we have Russia-Iran policy, we have Russia-Syria policy, we have Russia-Ukraine policy, we have Nord Stream 1 policy. Well, Russia doesn't see the world that way. And actually very few actors do see the world the way maybe that the US tries to compartmentalize it. All these issues are interlinked, and Russia will try to leverage where it can, and it might be, it might cooperate on Iran because it's in its interest, but then that doesn't mean it's going to cooperate on Ukraine. But the only way we could have an effective policy towards Russia is actually we view all these issues as interconnected. So Nord Stream 2 isn't going to, whatever happens, Russia gets the pipeline, Russia doesn't get the pipeline, it's not going to change its malign behavior. It has to be something much more comprehensive.
Thank you. So one last question, and then we will go to Q&A. Are there any lessons we've learned from this that we can apply to dealing with Russia, especially at the mix of commerce and geopolitics going forward? I know it's a big question.
Yeah. I think that any anyone who's running a country's energy supplies, whether it's homegrown or whether it's imported, you have to use a variety of tools to ensure energy security. And we tend to focus only on sort of like the extreme, or how do we prevent disruptions from Russia? But most of the tools that are available to actually, again, there's so many reasons why gas supplies can be disrupted. And so we have to have those tools in place, whether it's extensive storage, whether it's redundant infrastructure, whether it's interconnectors, whether it's dual fuel plants. There's so many emergency disruption plants. There's so many things that we can do to actually prevent disruptions and them having an effect on the markets. And the second thing is, let's don't give up. Let's don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Let's don't give up on gas, because something it was sort of in the background in the previous panel. Yes, gas is much more difficult to manage security of supply than solids that are coal, liquids that are oil. Yet the benefits in terms of low climate impact, low environmental impact are so great that we really should make the effort to be using more gas and not think, well, because it potentially, it could be an energy weapon, we should just not use it and try to find something else. So we have to create the conditions to use more gas, because that's in the meantime, until we have some sort of technological leap in the field of renewables, we don't have another low environmentally impacted source of energy.
Thank you. I'll turn to Mr. Milne, and then I'd also like Ambassador Morningstar to follow up and give us an answer to that, but paying attention to that Ukraine lens that you brought up earlier.
Well, in terms of lessons learned and how to proceed further, I don't think there is any panacea, but I think there are a few principles that need to be maintained and upheld and should not be deviated from in dealing with Russia, and that is essentially Russia needs to understand that Western values is about upholding the rule of law. Russia has to abide by the relevant rules and laws in Europe. When Russia enters the European market, European rules apply to Russian gas. Russia has to be forced, unfortunately, to respect the outcome of arbitrations that it has itself signed up to. I think that's the only way to deal with the Russians, and this is also, I think, the lesson that the European Commission has eventually learned.
Ambassador Minister.
I guess would come back to a few points. One, this is complicated. Two, I think Brenda's right. We need to have an overall strategy. Three, it seems to me, again, that the priority should be how to achieve the goal of a competitive and transparent European market and a competitive and transparent Gazprom. Everything else is a tactic. And, sanctions, yes or no, that would end up being a tactic. Does it help? Does it hurt? What kind of sanctions? How do we keep the United States and Europe together in dealing with Ukraine? So there are all sorts of issues, but I think we need to keep our eye on the ball as to what that number one priority is, while at the same time recognizing that Ukraine has very much of a legitimate stake in this issue.
Any final points on that?
I just think if you're going to look at this as an experience of both EU-US relations and internal EU relations, I mean, it is quite an amazing thing. One pipeline, and I mean, it's amazing, it's now been going since June of 2015. It's quite possible that this may go on for another 2 or 3 years. It is more panels. And there are a number of things about it. One of them is, I think the lessons for the Russians particularly, on the fact what they did is they did Nord Stream 1 in a much more, if you like, Pacific era. And they did Nord Stream 2 not appreciating that or connecting the dots to think actually post the invasion and annexation of parts of Ukraine, post the actual adoption of the third energy package and its bedding into ground, post the fact that by 2015, 2016, the Central Eastern European states knew how to operate the levers of the European Union, which they didn't back in 2006-07. All of these factors and actually then the European energy market is much more integrated and so forth. All of these factors make it much, much, much more difficult. And I wonder today if Mr. Putin and the elite members of the Russian elite around him who decided to do this, given all the grief they've had, would they ever have bothered if they'd realised in the first place? And I think that is an interesting question in all of this. And I wonder if they would have actually bothered. It's like there's lots of other things they could have done, but perhaps this wasn't a really good idea to start with. But I think what the really interesting thing with Nord Stream 2 is to look at the way it seemed to just copied Nord Stream from Nord Stream 1 and not really thought through how the context has so radically changed. And that's, I think, a lesson for the Russians.
Thank you for bringing up that context. All right, we'll now go to the audience. If anyone has any questions, please raise your hand. Remember to state your name and affiliation, and please give us questions, not comments.
I thought they were all so convincing there were no questions.
Vitaly Morozov, Hughes, Hubbard and Reed. I would like to follow up with Mr. Mulland regarding the arbitration. It's a significant award, $2.8 billion, and Gazprom has refused to comply with this. And Mr. Vitrenko mentioned today that they were hiding the assets, and I've seen the reports that they actually divested the assets right before the bailiffs knocked up on the doors. And I wanted to ask you, what is your assessment in general with these tactics of Gazprom, and what can you tell us about the status of those enforcement proceedings? Thank you.
Yes, I think it's our clear impression that Gazprom is doing everything possible to avoid paying up to that claim. And of course that has resulted in lengthy and complex proceedings in various jurisdictions. So we are involved in in a number of jurisdictions, some of which have most of the assets outside of Russia. So we have, at the outset, we decided there is no point even in trying to go after Gazprom's assets in Russia, because there is no way that Russian courts would rule against Gazprom. I think that's pretty clear. Then we have made another decision of principle, which is to not go after the gas that is being transited through Ukraine. And the idea is to demonstrate both to Gazprom but to the wider world that Naftogaz is a reliant transit provider. With regard to the prospects of succeeding, we are in, let's say, a decisive stage in terms of decisions on recognition and enforcement of the award in one major jurisdiction. We have a decision from the Swedish ordinary courts that reversed an initial decision to suspend enforcement. So based on the competent courts, the ordinary courts of Sweden, we are free to proceed to not only seize the assets but to execute. But again, also execution can be a protracted process. Did that respond to, let's say, your multifaceted question? Yes.
Any other questions? Thank you. Microphone coming.
Thank you. Henrik Forleper, I'm an independent energy analyst. My question is, to the entire panel and, most probably to the lawyers. Me as a non-lawyer looking at the amended gas directive that was probably intended to prevent Nord Stream 2, I'm looking at things that, like backdoors, escapes, and things like this. And one nice thing I saw is that, for example, the regulator responsible to implement the gas directive is national authority, so the German regulator. And the second is, like the regime of or possibility of exemptions. And my question is, is it feasible to put exemptions on Nord Stream, for example, if you have proof of energy security issues on that case, or is it absolutely what you would say absolutely not possible?
Okay, so the thing one of the difficulties with the amendment to the gas directive is that it's drafted in a suchly convoluted way, and for quite a long time there hasn't been actually a clean draft. So what you're looking at mostly is what's the trilogue draft, which is the strikeout draft with the final text agreed by the EU Council, that's Council, all the member states, the European Parliament and the Commission. And it's like the Senate and the House having a reconciliation, and that's the reconciliation draft. And it is actually it is complicated in itself and actually quite difficult to follow. So that's, I think, what has resulted in a lot of confusion. The fundamental baseline is this, that it is European law that's applied. So even though the German national regulator can make the first assessment and so forth, at every point he is blocked by the actual requirement to apply European Union law and the requirement to actually get the permission of the Commission. So, for example, under Article 36, which is the exemption provision, so if you don't want to comply with the liberalisation rules, you have to apply for an exemption. The exemption ultimately, although it can be requested by the German national regulator, has to be signed off by the Commission. So, and the problem is Article 36 has a whole series of provisions about whatever it is proposed, whatever pipeline it is, has to comply with to secure competition in the single market, to add to supply, to enhance competition, to ensure the full functioning of the single market. So that's actually really quite difficult for Nord Stream 2 to comply with. The second provision is what's known as the empowerment provision, which is new, which would allow the German National Regulatory Authority to enter into an intergovernmental agreement, say with Russia, over the pipeline where you've got it applying in two territories. The difficulty with that is that, again, in order to access that, you have to get the permission of the Commission, and all the Article 36 style obligations also apply. And the Commission also has to sign off on it. And each of those are decisions which are legally reviewable. And then in addition to that problem, there are some more. One of the other problems with it is that even if the German national regulator and the Commission were perhaps willing to play fast and loose, there's this case which is in relation to the Opel pipeline, which is the connecting pipeline to Nord Stream 1. So there's been a legal challenge about the Commission's exemption decision there, and it is very, very likely that Poland has brought the challenge, supported by Lithuania. It's very likely that Poland will succeed on that, and we're likely to have a ruling on that in either July or September. And the consequence of that is that that's actually, like, we're likely to get for the first time a very detailed view from the EU General Court about the scope of Article 36. And also the prospect that you have a Commission exemption decision struck down, or how can I put it, put a degree of concern into the minds of both the German National Regulatory Authority and the Commission, and incentivize Poland and Lithuania to actually challenge any decision under Nord Stream 2. So I think all of that has a significant impact on this in terms of your willingness to not do anything other than comply with the rules straightforwardly. The other issue which is worth mentioning is Article 11 of the Gas Directive, where you actually have to make a supply security assessment of a non-EU owner, and that will be quite difficult as well. I think the issue here is, of course, there is a question about, well, all of this, at the end of the day, you could find ways around it. One of the issues is, for example, is can you have a stub, actually create a little pipeline in the territorial sea. I think it's very artificial. And the difficulty with it, and again, I don't want to go into kind of a lot of legal stuff, but if you look at the basic principles of public international law, you don't even have to apply an effects doctrine to capture Nord Stream 2 and almost the whole of Nord Stream 2 within EU law. I mean, the point is that the physical bit which is in EU territory as such is of absolute value and necessity to the rest of the pipeline. The pipeline has no value and no sense, save for the bit which is physically on EU territory. I think you can legitimately take without applying an effects doctrine, say that the pipeline, EU law applies to the entire pipeline. And I think the Court of Justice would take that view. And there is some case law and a lot of legislative examples of that which have been applied beforehand. So the point, therefore, is that you would probably end up having a fairly significant legal argument which would go on for some time. And I think one of the ways that the amendment to the Gas Directive delays Nord Stream 2. The other question is, and I don't know the answer to this really, but it would appear to me from the level of alarm from Gazprom about the amendment to the Gas Directive, they certainly appear to think that it is much more of a problem. And I think there are maybe a number of reasons for that. One is if you have to apply cost-reflective tariffs, would that trigger in all of their other contracts with their customers a whole series, new range of arbitration cases opening up? And I think that may be one issue. But I think there are a number of other questions, but I don't want to go on, because one could talk about this. There's probably a few hours of seminars I could run on this, so I shall stop here.
The second question was our sanctions, is the legality of sanctions?
No, the question was just for the exemption on the
I think I think the exemption will be very problematic, essentially.
Any other questions in the audience, sir?
Yaroslav Martinyuk, formerly was Radio Liberty. I have not heard much about the fact that Ukraine is at war with Russia. There's a war going on. And I find it extremely hypocritical that Germany and Merkel, on the one hand, say they're critical of Russia, and on the other hand, they're open to dealing with Russia as if it's a normal situation. It seems like Germany is throwing Ukraine under the bus for the sake of its own economic interests. Just second part, I was amazed to learn that 24 of the 28 European countries disapprove of the Nord Stream 2. I mean, what has happened to the rule of law in Europe when the vast majority cannot stop Germany from going ahead against the wishes of the major European Union?
Two responses. One on the 24 of the 28. I don't think anybody was saying that meant that the fact that 24 countries approved the amendments to the gas directive did not necessarily mean that 24 countries disapproved of Nord Stream 2. There are a lot of countries that do, and if you had a vote up and down among the 28 member states, it might come out that more opposed Nord Stream 2 than supported it, but I'm not sure that it would be 24 to 4.
No, I think the point was pretty close to that, because essentially, if you're supporting the amendment to the gas directive, you're putting a very serious delay and problems in relation to Nord Stream 2. I mean, it may well be that they managed to gather a couple of extra states because everyone was going along the same flow, but pretty much, I would say, because if you look at it, the initial reaction back in 2015 is you had an immediate letter of 10 Central Eastern European heads of government who immediately opposed it. And one of the problems with this is what's happened is, I think, is that the level of antipathy to the pipeline has grown. Partly, I think, because of the recognition in a lot of European states that this is a threat to the single market. That is a broader threat. Let me give you an example of this. Is that if you look at what happens with Nord Stream 2, the gas comes in to Greifswald, and then it goes on a pipeline eastward to Ogal. It goes nowhere near Western Europe. And the point is that the interconnectors from west to east are then flooded with Russian gas. You switch off the Brotherhood pipeline and the Ukrainian transit route, and then essentially, in principle, you've got Gazprom in a situation of tremendous market dominance, and you effectively split the single market. On one side, you have a Gazprom-dominated market, almost going back to the situation it was in 2003, and on the other side, you have a more liberalized, Western functioning market. This is why Poland has moved so rapidly to try and get the Baltic pipeline in place and enhance its LNG capacity for this very reason. But the point about it is when it became clear the negative level of the impact of Nord Stream 2, you ended up with a lot more member states in Western Europe beginning to move onto the side of the Central Eastern European states. Also, there's just the double standards issue that the South Stream was stopped, upsetting Bulgaria, some of the other South East European states and Italy, and the sense that the Germans seem to get a special deal. So that actually created a situation that they also were not very happy. Also, the Russians had actually added to the alliance against Nord Stream 2 by, for example, bringing a lot of disinformation operations against Spain via the whole Catalonian independence issue. I mean, I was told by some Central Eastern European states they were quite surprised that Spain was taking such a firm line against Nord Stream 2. And well, it's Catalonia. It's the Russians supporting Catalonia. So one of the things that I think that part of this is, I said earlier, about you can. I made the joke about you can have Nord Stream 2, or you can have an interference in the Russian elections. Well, there's a European equivalent. You can have Nord Stream 2, or you can interfere in the British elections, in the French elections, in the German elections, in everybody else's elections, but you can't do both. And I think there's a sense in that to some degree, Russian energy strategies and influence strategies in relation to energy are cutting across all their other strategies they're operating. You can't do all of these things. You can't create those many enemies and affect so many states without the EU states in some sense responding. And I think that's what they've done to some degree. They've actually increased their enemies. Sorry, sorry.
Yes,
Mr. Miller?
I think you're right, Alan, that a major concern in Europe is about segregation of markets. And that's also one of our main arguments based on competition law. But I think there's one perhaps even much more serious issue at stake that's not strictly legal in a sense, but that has to a very small extent been discussed here today, and that is the security issues related to Nord Stream 2, because as we have discussed, Nord Stream 2 assumes that the Ukrainian gas transmission system will be stranded, that there will be no Russian transit through Ukraine, which will in effect provide Russia with a free hand to interfere in other parts of Ukraine than the easternmost parts. And that is, of course, a very serious concern in Ukraine, and I think it's also a growing concern in Europe, because the situation in Ukraine would, of course, affect the security situation in Europe as a whole.
Just on your point, there certainly is a division within Europe. You know, not that it's important, but on the 24-4 question, it's also a question of intensity. I mean, there are some countries who would say, take Malta. I mean, they may have gone along with the directive, with the amendments, but I can't believe they feel very intensely about the issue. On your point, first point about how can, basically you made the geopolitical argument that how can this happen? That was the point I was making at the beginning, that so many here in the United States feeling about this situation is just that. How, after what Ukraine has done, can this pipeline be allowed that would have such a detrimental, could have such a detrimental effect on Ukraine? That's basically the geopolitical argument, along with increased dependence. But then it gets all tied up on some of the complicated issues that we talked about. But that's the gut reaction, I would agree.
Thank you, Ambassador Morningstar. I'll turn to Mr. Vitrenko for a final question or point. Question.
To Ambassador Morningstar. So the reason why Gazprom owes us $2.8 billion is because they failed on their commitment to deliver 110 BCM for transit. So what is the purpose, or what's the reason, or the sense basically for Naftagaz to give up this right to get this $2.8 billion in return for some new commitments from Gazprom now to deliver 90 instead of 100? And just to, again, to continue the same kind of line, wouldn't it be more important basically, or and more reasonable in terms of reaching the objective that you mentioned, a functioning and transparent and efficient market in Europe, again the gas market in Europe, to make Gazprom play by the rules and to punish Gazprom for breaking these rules now? Because can you imagine a functioning and efficient market where a dominant player in this market can break the rules so easily without any kind of punishment or consequences, just to hear like a discussion about the importance of having an efficient market?
I'm not disagreeing with you, really. I mean, the 2.8 billion is important, and they should be complying with that decision. My only point is that in any litigation, theoretically, and I'm saying very theoretically, there could be settlements where it would be more valuable for Ukraine to go along with a settlement and give that up. I'm not saying it'll happen. It's unlikely.
You have a recent precedent from Israel-Egypt, where Egypt was supposed to pay also close to $2 billion in compensation for the disruption of gas supplies after the rise of Morsi in Egypt. Arbitration award, and the government decided, and with cooperation with a variety of companies, to give up the award in order to to retain peaceful relations.
So all I'm saying is, yeah, it's unlikely, and yes, it's important, but never say never. I learned never to say never when the last time I learned was when I said Trump would never be elected. So you know, you never, you know,
No,
well,
said it.
so you know, let's see how it's unfold. As far as punishing Gazprom, I think what you said is critically important. Gazprom should be forced to comply with the rules, to act transparently and act competitively. The question, which is a little bit much more of a difficult question that really needs to be thought through, is what are the tactics to get there? And so I'd leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for the answers. As we've seen, there are many challenges, but we've got good minds looking at it. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists and to our audience taking the time.